It gives me great pleasure to welcome Nicola and Allan to the stage. I want to once again formally thank the First Minister and the Scottish Government for their support of the Women in Conflict Fellowship Programme. I think some of you will have seen the session with Stefan de Mistura yesterday, and also with our fellows from Kashmir, Yemen, Syria, and Pakistan. And I think both those sessions demonstrate the power of the fellowship principle. So I'm extremely indebted to Nicola, but also to the Scottish Parliament who have lent their support, and to all the parties of Scotland who back this initiative. I also wanted to say one thing about that type of initiative. It's needed more than ever because we need the support of small nations to support the rule-based global order more than ever before. And so I also want to praise Scotland's role as a global citizen in not only supporting peacemaking, but the rule of law, human rights, and the ability of small nations to come together, try and affect change in relation to climate change and other important international matters. So thank you, Nicola, for being here. And finally, I also want to take this opportunity after 10 years of Beyond Borders to thank my friend, my very special friend, Alan Little. You can only get gatherings off the ground like this in the early days with the support of people who the public trust, and I know they trust Alan Little. He has been absolutely inspirational for us. It says something about this man that while chairing the Edinburgh Book Festival, he comes to our festival time and time again to conduct important interviews. Although I will say he's probably got a bit of a run for his money now as an interviewer, having seen Nicola interview Tina Brown here 2 years ago. So anyway, could you please give a warm welcome to two remarkable people who are going to discuss the remarkable politics of our time.
Mark, thank you very much. That's a very generous thing to say. I'd much rather answer questions about Iraq than myself. It's very unusual to be the centre of attention when you're in my role, but one of the great privileges of being at Beyond Borders is I get to share a stage occasionally with people like Nicola. We last sat on this stage together 4 years ago. You'd been First Minister for less than a year. And we talked about your appearance on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, which had just happened. What I'd like to start... The other great thing about this festival is I don't have to pretend to be Jeremy Paxman.
Much better than that.
We don't have to do a sort of faux antagonistic gladiatorial exhibition. And we can just have a probing, interesting exploration, rummage around Nicola's mind.
Good luck.
So let me ask you first of all, Nicola, we all saw you on the steps of Bute House with Boris Johnson. Janie Godley had great fun with it. What happened in that meeting? Give us some sense of how it went.
Well, I have kind of taken to answering the question what was being said on the steps of Bute House with the answer, just watch the Janie Godley voiceover and you know what was going through my head at the time. What happened in that meeting? It was, in many ways, quite a bizarre meeting. Boris Johnson in private is pretty much the same as Boris Johnson in public, and you can judge for yourselves whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But there is, it's almost a kind of carefree recklessness. There's just a shrugging of the shoulders in response to quite serious and pressing questions about the implications of a no-deal Brexit in particular, with this is not what he actually says, but it is what he oozes. Don't worry about that, it'll all be fine on the night. And if it's not, well, it's not going to be me that pays the price of it. And I think it's really, really troubling that we have a government that knowingly, and I would say now deliberately, is driving the country off a cliff edge. And they know as well as I know, and unfortunately perhaps the public don't know because some of this information has not been shared with the public, just how painful and catastrophic that is going to be.
And what do we know about what will happen in the event of a no-deal Brexit?
Well, you're going to, and the first thing I should say is I have a responsibility, my government has a responsibility to try to stop the worst impacts of, well, firstly to try to stop a no-deal Brexit happening, which we will continue to try to do, but we've also got an obligation to do whatever we can to minimise and mitigate some of the implications of it if it does happen. And we're working very hard to do that. I personally chair our no-deal planning resilience group. There's a lot of time, effort, money that frankly would be better spent on more productive uses going into all of that just now. But what are we looking at? I mean, immediately we're going to see it become more difficult to export and import vital goods in and out of the country. And that will be food. We could have exporters, lorries stuck at the border, talking particularly here the Dover-Calais crossing for quite some time. Now, from a Scottish perspective, that is really serious because you don't have to have very long delays for our salmon and seafood exporters to have catastrophic losses in what they produce. A lot of these companies operate to very fine margins. We will find it more difficult potentially to import medicines or certain food products. And that's just in the immediate few days. The shock to the economy. I mean, our economic advisors have modelled, and modelling sometimes is right, sometimes it's wrong, sometimes it's somewhere in the middle. But what it shows is there's a distinct possibility, if there's a no-deal Brexit, of our economy tipping very quickly into recession, with tens of thousands of jobs being lost. Now, for a government to do that, or to risk that eventuality, knowing all of this, to me beggars belief. And I find it quite hard to get my head round, to be perfectly frank.
What is happening at Westminster this weekend? I know that some of your own MPs have not come home this weekend. They've stayed down there. Presumably they're in talks with people in other parties. What kind of relationship do you want with the Labour Party and with the Lib Dems and others to try to stop a no-deal Brexit? Whatever
relationship is required. I mean, I think one of the things we're all going to have to do is swallow our differences. I might not relish the prospect of sitting down and finding a way to work with Jeremy Corbyn. But if that's what it takes to stop this catastrophe, then we've got to try and do it. So I've taken the view that we shouldn't be ruling anything out at the moment. And any option that might enable us to avoid that crashing out on the 31st of October, we should be prepared to consider it. With every day that passes, those options become more limited and less likely to come to fruition. But there are options, passing legislation on an emergency basis in the House of Commons to take control of the programme of business, through to some proposals around emergency governments and caretaker prime ministers. I can't sit here and tell you right now that any of these will prove to be possible, but it's not going to be for the want of trying on my part or the SNP's part.
And if there were a vote of no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn...
that would probably be later. He's getting ahead of himself.
What does that say? Oh, dear. If there were a vote of no confidence in Boris Johnson's government, you would, of course, support that.
Oh, yes.
And would you... When you say I'm not ruling anything out, does that include Jeremy Corbyn as a possible caretaker Prime Minister?
Well, the proposal he put forward, which involved... Now, I should say part of the responsibility for where we are right now, in my view, lies on the shoulders of Jeremy Corbyn, who has sat on the fence on Brexit until his backside must be really sore. But yes, we would consider options like that. Does that fill me with joy? No. But when we're in severe situations of peril like this, then frankly, I mean, I disagreed with Jo Swinson, who immediately ruled out that option, although I think she's probably backtracked a little bit. We have to kind of put our differences to one side if we're to have a chance of this. And the option of a caretaker Prime Minister, I think, would have to be very short term, and then a general election could allow perhaps more sensible heads.
And in the event of a general election, would you consider electoral pacts with other parties?
I have always said, and people ask me these questions, and I've been, I think, for a politician, pretty consistent throughout my time as First Minister. And I've been First Minister now for less than 5 years. I've already fought 2 UK general elections in that time. I don't foresee a situation where there would be a formal coalition between Labour and the SNP or the SNP and any other party. But I've also always said that I would want the SNP, if the arithmetic made this possible, to be part of what I've described as a progressive alternative to a Conservative government, particularly a Conservative government threatening so much damage to the country. So yes is the short answer to that. Obviously, I would want to work hard to make sure that whoever led that progressive alternative was doing sensible things and things that were in the interests of Scotland. But I'm prepared. People sometimes, I guess, think that I must be sitting here thinking how fantastic it is that the UK is going to hell in a handcart because it builds the case for Scottish independence. I think it does strengthen the case for Scottish independence, but there is no part of me relishes what's happening in the UK right now. It's tragic. We haven't. Mark was talking about the importance of small countries and what small countries can do to, build respect for and adherence to the international rules-based order. There's a big questions about respect for the rule of law and rules-based orders in the UK right now. There is a serious debate happening in this country. It's on the front page of The Observer, I think, today, about whether it would be possible and acceptable for the government to shut down Parliament in order to steamroller Brexit through. I mean, really, let's all take a step back from this. What is happening that we're actually allowing and entertaining debates like that to gain any kind of currency?
I could fill the whole hour with talking about Brexit and where we're at with avoiding a no-deal Brexit, but there are lots of things I'd like to get through, including the thing that Mark was talking about the role of small nations in promoting the values that sustain a rules-based international order. I want to ask you about that in due course. But since you mentioned independence, where do you think the opinion in the country is now on independence? There does seem to be some alignment between Remain sentiment and Yes sentiment, a much greater alignment than we've seen before. Is that how you read it?
Yes. So where does opinion lie? I mean, obviously we've got opinion polls and the private work that parties at the SNP will do. I think if there was an independence referendum tomorrow, Scotland would vote to be independent. Now, that may still, I don't know, I suspect it might not be as narrow a result as the polls are showing. I think there is a quite sizable group of people who voted no in 2014, who voted Remain in 2016, who now look at independence in a way that they didn't before because they see independence potentially as being the best way to protect and preserve Scotland's place in the world and our very identity as an open and outward-looking and tolerant country. There are undoubtedly some people who might have voted yes in 2014 who polls would suggest would vote no again because they don't want to be part of the European Union. My theory, and it is a theory, although it's based on talking at some length to some of these people, I think when it came to a decision point in the polling booth, yes or no to independence, I think most of these people would still vote yes to independence, which makes me think the margin might be greater than the polls suggest just now. That said, I know that we've still got work to do to persuade and to convince, and I think it's really important that we do that respectfully, that we don't indulge ourselves or give in to the temptation to win the case for independence in the way some of the Brexiteers decided to win the case for Brexit, in my view, dishonestly and in an overly simplistic way. I'm a great believer in that how we campaign for independence. People are entitled to look at that and draw conclusions about the country we would want an independent Scotland to be. So I think it's important that we always bear that in mind in how we conduct the argument.
There's a problem that wasn't there in 2014. That's the question of the border. If an independent Scotland were to seek membership of the European Union and be accepted, you have the prospect of a hard border not just across the island of Ireland, but across the island of Britain as well. What's your thinking on that?
Well, the first thing to say is I don't want borders. There's nothing in what I propose, there's nothing in what I've ever proposed as a politician that necessitates borders between Scotland and England or or anywhere else. Scotland's trade with the rest of the UK is vitally important. The rest of the UK's trade with Scotland is vitally important, and I want to find the ways of protecting that. And I think it is, I think it's hyperbole on the part of anti-independence politicians to somehow paint a picture that all stops the minute we become independent. But I don't want Scotland to be in the position of having to choose between trading across the UK and trading freely across the European single market that is 8 times bigger. If you look at the trade picture of Ireland, the export patterns of Ireland after Ireland became independent, I know in a different era, in different circumstances, when Ireland became independent, its trade was heavily focused on the rest of the UK. In the years after, that changed, and now most of Ireland's trade is with the wider European Union. So I don't want borders. Now, the hard question is, how do we avoid that in the scenario? For all I think we are unfortunately heading, unless we can find ways of stopping it, for a no-deal Brexit, ultimately the UK is going to have to accept some of the realities of how it keeps trade flowing and how it avoids the situation in Ireland. The reason I spent so much time after the Brexit vote arguing, if you have to have Brexit, stay in the single market because in the customs union, because it takes away some of this. Now, I think in the fullness of time, that's where the UK is inevitably going to have to end up back to, and we have to wait and see where that all ends up before we fashion our response in a Scottish context. But the final point I would make here is, and it comes back to a point I've made earlier on, there's a real responsibility and onus on somebody like me, leading and the case for and arguing for independence, to be frank with people at all points about what the implications are.
And what about the Government Expenditure and Revenue Service report recently that Scotland is running a 7% budget deficit?
Well, it's a lower one than last year, and it's reducing. There is, I'm not going to sit here, and these are estimates prepared by Scottish Government statisticians, so it would be foolish for me to sit here and say they're made up. They're not made up. But they are based on a number of assumptions, because Scotland is not an independent country. They're based on a set of assumptions, and they're based on policy decisions that are out with our control. So they make assumptions for the level of defence expenditure. Now, the level of defence expenditure that is attributed to Scotland as part of the UK is not necessarily going to be the level of defence expenditure that an independent Scotland would choose to make. So it reflects our position within the UK. It doesn't reflect what life in an independent Scotland would be. But I guess the more fundamental point, I understand why they do it, but I've never understood why they get away with it so easily. If you, as an opponent of independence, are reduced to saying that actually Scotland, as part of the UK, we've made you a subsidy junkie with a massive deficit, and that's why you should stay part of the UK, it doesn't really strike me as a very strong argument. If that's our position as part of the UK, then that is an argument for change. We spend a lot of time making these arguments. If you're not hearing it, if people are not hearing it, then that tells us we need to do that more loudly and more persuasively. I mean, I kind of take it as self-evident that we weren't as persuasive as we needed to be in 2014 because the result went the way it did. So we need to be more persuasive. But if you look around, and obviously the work Andrew Wilson led for us in the Growth Commission, which showed how responsibly, a deficit like that could be made sustainable over a period of time. And interestingly, the GERS figures show that we're already at a lower percentage deficit than Andrew's work had predicted we would be in 2021. So we're making progress faster than he predicted. But you look across other comparable countries, and they all tend to be richer with healthier fiscal situations than Scotland. Now, either you take the view that Scotland's somehow inherently not capable of, doing as well as they do, or which I don't think many people would, or you take the view that there is something inherent in how we're currently governed that is leading to that situation.
I was talking to somebody here who might well be in this tent actually yesterday. I said, I'm interviewing the First Minister tomorrow. What should I ask her? And he said, tell her to get on with it. Now, you've got that constituency in your own party who are getting frustrated that you're not getting on with it.
Well, we are getting on with it. I mean, in a sense, I sympathise with that view. I want independence last week at the latest. I mean, I've spent my entire life, adult life, campaigning for this. So the idea that this is not as urgent or as important to me as it is to anybody else it doesn't really bear much scrutiny. But I don't want to just have a referendum. I want to win independence in that referendum. And that, for me, is the aim. And if that involves at any stage applying a bit more patience and recognising we've still got work to do, then I think that is worth it to get to the outcome that I want to see. But, you know, when people say to me, just get on with it, it kind of strikes me that maybe I haven't explained enough about what we are actually doing right now. The Scottish Parliament goes back into session next week. There is legislation before the Scottish Parliament to put in place the framework for the referendum, to effectively put in place the rules and regulations, the campaign rules, how the referendum would be conducted. So that's a necessary thing that we have to do, and we're doing that. I said earlier this year, I thought the timing for a referendum would be next year, probably towards the latter part of next year. I do think there is a question about whether we need to accelerate that, given what's likely to happen, and you know, we are thinking through that at the moment. So we are getting on with it. And the last point I would make to those who understandably are frustrated is that not only is nothing stopping all of us who believe in independence getting out there and making the case, because we still have people to convince, then actually the more we do that, the more we can be confident that when that date comes, as it will, then we're going to come out of it not with the heartbreak of 2014, but with the job ahead of us of building that new independent country.
Two problems, though. One is that you face the possibility of a rival pro-independence party. How do you view that?
Look, you know, at the end of the day, I'm a great believer as a leader. You're responsible for the party you lead and making it into the political force that people want to vote for. And yeah, I don't want to sound immodest here, but I think we've been, and you know, since I've been SNP leader, I've been reasonably successful at that. So I will continue. If you support independence in Scotland, then in my view, the obvious thing to do and the most effective thing to do is to vote SNP. If you start gaming electoral systems, then you run the risk of ending up with a counterproductive result there. But I'll concentrate on making the SNP the force that people who support independence, and indeed even some people who don't support independence, want to vote for. And
constitutionally, you can't do it unless Westminster.
Well, that's never been tested. We've accepted, and I still think, you know, in 2014 we had the gold standard. We had an agreement between the Scottish and UK governments, a process that everybody agreed was sound, that would be respected internationally. You've got to have a process like that. You know, people, again, sometimes say, you know, why can't we just do it the way Catalonia did it? And I've got huge sympathy for, you know, independent supporters in Catalonia. But I would point out that they're not independent. You know, so I don't want a process that leads to us maybe feeling a bit better about ourselves, but not actually being independent.
So if Westminster says no,
well, let me come on to that point. But this point is important, I think, for everybody to understand who wants to achieve independence, not just who wants to have another chance at having the vote. You have to have a process that is capable of allowing a clear majority to be expressed. That's democracy. And you have to have a process that will be recognised, not just in the UK, although that's not unimportant, but recognised in Europe and internationally. I mean, I travel a lot in Europe. I speak to lots of people in the European institutions and member states whose view of independence has transformed since 2014 because of Brexit, who would welcome an independent Scotland with open arms. But they need to know that it is a democratic and recognised
that it would have legitimacy
process. Now, what happens if Westminster says no? I mean, I'll be honest here, I get a bit irritated when I get asked that question so often, not at you, but at others who, at the Jeremy Paxmans of this world, because frankly, yes, people are entitled to ask me whatever questions they want, but I'm the one who is arguing for a democratic, constitutional, precedented process. The pressure should be on those who are anti-democratically somehow suggesting that it is acceptable to block that kind of process. It is perfectly legitimate. As you said, there'll be people in this room right now that are passionately opposed to independence and always will be. That is 100% legitimate. We have an honest disagreement. What is not legitimate, in my view, is to take a view that says that it's for anybody other than the Scottish people to decide that. So the question should be getting asked of people who argue that. But secondly, this Westminster will block it. I think it's fair to say that position has started to crumble a bit in the last few weeks.
Not in the Conservative Party.
Well, no, so the Conservative Party have gone from, and I'm not saying they've moved enough on this, they haven't, clearly, from what I'm about to say. But if you listen carefully to the Conservative Party, they've gone from a no, not ever. Well, they started with now's not the time. It then hardened into a no, not ever. We never want another referendum. To now it's, well, only if the SNP get a majority in 2021. So already that is shifting because they know it's unsustainable. They know it is. We now have polls showing that a majority not only support independence but want a decision point in the kind of timescale that I'm talking about. And of course, it's completely crumbled in the Labour Party. But then so has most other things.
How has your conversation with European leaders changed as a result of Brexit? You were in Europe in Brussels earlier this year. Famously, Jeremy Hunt withdrew any diplomatic support for your visits. And
I quote.
That's kind of what made the headlines, oddly. But the content of I never learned the content of your conversation with Juncker, for example. What did you talk about?
Well, we talked principally about Brexit. I'm not going to go into the detail of what are private conversations, but of course independence crops up in these discussions. You asked me how has it changed. I mean, I'll be pretty basic about this. I remember in the run-up to 2014 speaking to people in other European countries who, and I don't mean this as a criticism of them, they struggled to understand what the Scottish independence movement was all about. Why did Scotland want to be independent? Brexit has changed that almost at a stroke. So now you talk to people in France or Germany, and Scotland, because we're not independent, is being removed from the EU against our will, suddenly makes them understand it in a way that they maybe struggled with before. The EU, since it was established, has existed to try and enlarge itself. I always thought it was incredible in 2014 that the EU would do anything other than welcome an independent Scotland with open arms. I find it even less credible to argue that now. So there's been a sea change in attitudes. The EU's never going to, and arguably nor should it, come out and take a position on Scottish independence, nor are other governments. But suffice to say, it is night and day talking to these kind of people now compared to what it was like in advance of 2014.
What about the thing Mark was talking about there, the role that small nations play when they're independent in soft power, in promoting and protecting the rules-based international order that was established after the catastrophe of the Second World War? And what role can a devolved country like Scotland play in that? What is Scotland doing to uphold those values internationally?
Well, we are, as a devolved government, already pretty active in the space, and perhaps counterintuitively, I'm not going to sit here and argue we have to be independent before we can do anything. So one of the reasons I'm here today is to meet the 1325 Women in Conflict Fellows. That Stefan de Mistura, the former UN envoy to Syria, is here today, and he encouraged me a few years ago to fund this fellowship for Scotland to be active and influential in trying to promote the voice and the role and the influence of women in peacemaking and peace building. So that's one example of how we are operating on the global stage. We have an international development budget that, technically we don't have responsibility for international development, but we've also always seen that as a really important thing to do. So the work we do in Africa and countries like Malawi and Zambia in particular, the scholarships we fund in Pakistan for girls and women's education. I've never been of the view and never will be of the view that we should allow the sort of technical limitations on our powers to stop us being a voice for peace and the kind of values and promoting respect for the rules-based order on the international stage. Clearly, we could have much more clout and influence as a sovereign, independent country. But there's a lot we can do now, and I hope we live up to that.
I feel we've just scratched the surface, but I'm going to stop talking myself now and invite you to ask questions of Nicola's. Well, question down here, and two ladies in the front here. So that question there first.
You talk about being, your party talks about being progressive and outward-looking. How do you square that with the word nationalist in your title and all the connotations that that has?
Well, I found myself talking about this quite a lot recently because a couple of years ago at the Edinburgh Book Festival, I made the comment that if I could go back 90 years to the establishment of my party, I might call it something different to Scottish National Party. And no disrespect to the media here, but that was kind of contorted a little bit away from the meaning that I attached to it. I do have a bit of an issue with the word nationalist, and it's nothing to do with my own party's values and outlook, but it's to do with the connotations of that word. If you look at the many movements across the world that are described as nationalist right now, well, firstly, very few of them, or, well, certainly not all of them, are campaigning for the independence of their countries. So, you know, it's not that there is an absolute alignment between the word nationalist and independence movements. What you often find are movements that are based on an exceptionalism of a particular country or ethnic group within a country, a majoritarianism, which is often accompanied by illiberalism and the othering of minorities, and a very insular approach. Now, if you think of nationalism in that context, the movement I am part of couldn't be further removed from that. You know, the SNP is, I think I can say this without fear of contradiction, or certainly fear of legitimate contradiction, is the most pro-immigration party in the UK right now. Independence, more so now than ever, is actually about staying connected in a European and international basis. I don't care where you come from. If you live in Scotland, where you come from is irrelevant. The contribution you make to Scotland is all that matters. The fact that you see Scotland as your home is all that matters. So, you know, that is a world away. Now, are there people who support independence who would be more akin to the nationalism of other countries that I've described? Of course there will be, because, you know, there will always be individuals around a movement that I wouldn't necessarily find myself aligned to. But the broad-based independence movement in Scotland is progressive and outward-looking and inclusive, and is not ethnically based at all. It's a genuine civic nationalism, and it's unfortunate that that word, I think, sometimes leads people, not so much at home but internationally, to reach different conclusions about us.
Gentleman there.
Thank you. So you want the gold standard of a Westminster stand for independence referendum. You don't want a Catalonia. You think the Conservatives will crumble eventually. But what happens if they don't? What happens if you don't get assent from Westminster? Are there conditions under which you would unilaterally have an independence referendum? Thank you.
I've made my views, not just today, but generally clear about the type of process I think is required to achieve independence in a meaningful way. Beyond that, forgive this, I hope this doesn't sound too much like the typical politician not want to answer a question, but I'm not going to sort of openly start talking about my tactics if things that I don't think should happen and necessarily will happen come to pass. Obviously, if we get to that bridge, then I will set out how we intend to cross it. But I think the position that Westminster parties have taken, and particularly the Conservative Party have taken today, is so completely unsustainable and undemocratic that I think it is reasonable for me to continue to try to ensure that that crumbles before getting dragged down other routes that are suboptimal from my perspective and shouldn't be necessary.
Yes.
Thank you both, first of all. Nicola, it's my opinion that you are one of the best communicators on the political circuit.
Thanks, Mum.
And as I'll not take objection to that.
She's not my mum, I should say. She's nowhere near old enough to be my mum, I should also say.
Thank you. However, much as I understand that as a result, the SNP puts you forward to communicate in all sorts of situations and on all sorts of platforms. It leaves me with some concerns out with Ian Blackford and Joanna Cherry about who are the other people within SNP and are they of a similar calibre to you? So obviously you're going to say yes, but I'd like you to flesh out that answer a bit, please.
Yes is the short answer. Sometimes I find, I'm kind of damned if I do, damned if I don't. So I got, pelters from sections of the media in opposition earlier this week because I was campaigning in the Shetland by-election on the day the GERS figures were announced. So Derek Mackay, my finance secretary, one of the incredibly capable people in the SNP, fronted that for me. Now, this was apparently, dreadful. Hasten to add, if the media had been doing their job of covering the by-election, they would have been in Shetland with me and they could have asked me the questions there, but I digress. The SNP has a wealth of talent. I can look at my own cabinet, young people like Derek, Hamza Yousaf, the Justice Secretary, your Shirley-Anne Somerville, the Social Security Minister. We've got more established people like John Swinney, Jean Freeman, the Health Secretary. I'm immediately going to damn people by not mentioning them. Everybody's wonderful. In the Westminster Parliamentary group, you've mentioned Ian Blackford and Jo Cherry. I could equally point to Stuart MacDonald. In fact, we've got two Stuart MacDonalds who are both very capable. To Mary Black, the youngest, I think still the youngest MP in the House of Commons, who is one of the most capable young politicians I have ever come across. But that would be confining myself, and there's lots that I haven't mentioned there, to our elected ranks. We have, right now, and I'll be slightly immodest here for a second, not about myself, but my generation of people in the SNP. I grew up in the SNP amongst a group of a youth wing at the time that I think was exceptionally talented. I was in the youth wing with people like Fiona Hislop, Richard Lockhead, a lot of people that then went on into government. I look at our youth wing today, and it's probably not since then that I've seen such a talented group of young people coming through the ranks. So, I appreciate it's always very, I know, for years this was a frustration of Alex Salmond because he was the leader and therefore who everybody went to, and he had to work very hard to have other voices heard. I've got to do the same. But trust me, I'm a politician. There is a genuine wealth of talent in the SNP ranks.
I've got a question here, and then a gentleman there.
It's embarrassing to admit this, but I've been campaigning against Trident for about 40 years, and I just wondered if you could help me out. You talk about these small countries like Scotland, and they seem to manage without nuclear weapons.
Yeah. Well, most countries in the world manage without nuclear weapons. It's the norm to be nuclear free, not to have nuclear weapons. I've been campaigning against nuclear weapons for probably just short of 40 years. I joined CND before I joined the SNP and remain as passionate in my opposition to weapons of mass destruction as I've ever been.
It's going to be a problem, though, isn't it, if Scotland were to become independent? What do you do with that base? What happens to it?
Well, it's arguably not our problem. It's arguably the problem of the UK government. Look, we'd always be responsible. These are incredibly dangerous
But you would
weapons.
seek to work with them, wouldn't you,
if you're asking me, would I look
solution?
to bargain in a way that allowed us to keep Trident in Scotland in return for something else? No. I want to see... I'm a unilateralist in terms of nuclear disarmament. I know there are different opinions on that, but that's my position, and I would want to see nuclear Trident leaving Scotland as soon as it was safe and feasible to do so, because apart from the moral issues around nuclear weapons, the amount of money that gets sunk into nuclear weapons right now at the expense of conventional defence, let alone some other uses for that money, is, in my view, really shameful.
Two questions at the same time.
Thank you.
We've only got a few minutes left, so
go ahead.
Very
okay.
short if you can.
I'm one of the people in the tent that's concerned about the rest of the planet. It's not just UK politics and independence. We're concerned about the planet burning, kind of literally. And we heard today very powerful talk about the things that can be done globally. How would an independent Scotland differ to a UK government approach to climate, energy and climate change?
That should really always be the first question, and I apologise for not asking it. You're absolutely right, sir. And one question down here.
Thank you both for your talk. Defence of the realm goes further than issues around Trident. It involves issues around anti-terrorism,
Yeah.
cyber resilience, and international relations generally. And indeed, aspects of trading partners from certain countries of the world. Would you like to offer a few comments on that? Because that will be critically important, irrespective of whether you change conventional defence of the realm or other.
Yeah. Okay. Let me take that one first. I mean, every country needs a strong defence. If Scotland was independent, certainly it is the position of the SNP that we would invest appropriately in strong conventional defences. A country like Scotland will always need to work with others. You know, Scotland being independent will not change the fact that our closest allies will be the rest of the UK and the British Isles. There is my focus on often the disagreements between Scottish and UK governments doesn't allow me the space to say that we work very closely together on issues of counter-terrorism and intelligence and security, and that would always continue. On trade, short of Scotland being independent, I have profound concerns right now about some of the Scottish interests that perhaps will be compromised in trade negotiations, particularly trade negotiations with countries like the United States. And I think even short of independence, we need to have a much greater say and clout in some of that. But these partnerships, again, it comes back to the fundamental point I'm making here. Whatever independence could have been characterised, in my view, wrongly, as being about in the past, today independence is the best way for Scotland of securing those international relationships and partnerships. It's not being independent that is putting them under strain and in jeopardy. And lastly, if we didn't start with it, we should certainly finish with it. The biggest issue facing all of us, and it is a moral issue, is the future of the planet. Again, Scotland, if we were independent, would have levers and powers and access to resources that we don't have right now, but that is not getting in the way of Scotland doing what we need to do to live up to our responsibilities to end our contribution to climate change. We are in the process of setting new targets which will see us reach net zero emissions by 2045, which I know I see you rolling your eyes, but that's what the science and the expert opinion tells us is the earliest right now we can do it. But we're building into that legislation obligations on government to bring that forward along the way as far as the science and expertise tells us we can do that. Right now, though, that is the earliest target that will be set anywhere in the UK. We're already significantly ahead of anywhere else in the UK and probably most other countries in Europe and the world in terms of moving away from reliance on fossil fuels to renewable energy. But there is so much more to do that government has to do to show leadership here, and then to enable individual citizens to do the same. We can show leadership. I was following Mary Robinson at the Edinburgh Book Festival this afternoon, who was saying that in her view Scotland was leading the world here. But we can't just continue to claim to be leading the world. We've got a job to do to raise the bar of world leadership as we do it and make sure that we continue to be at the leading end of it. But you're absolutely right to say it is the most important issue that any of us confront today.
I'm being told to wind up now. Sorry to those of you who've still got your hands up. I went to see the brilliant nature writer Robert Macfarlane at the Edinburgh Book Festival, and he said the question we should all ask ourselves every day is, are we being good ancestors?
Yeah.
It's a very succinct and beautiful way to put it. Coming up in this tent, by the way, is Lindsay Hilsum, who's one of my oldest friends and one of the finest broadcast journalists in the UK. Nicola's just been planting a tree in memory of Marie Colvin, who was also a friend of mine and a very close friend of Lindsay's. Lindsay's written a book about Marie. She was killed in Syria in 2012. Last week it won the James Tate Black Biography Prize, one of the most prestigious literary awards in Britain. Lindsay is brilliant speaking about this. Please come and hear her. She'll be both entertaining and very poignant, talking about somebody she loved very much. Please thank Nicola Sturgeon.